Hi everyone, I'm Becca Summers with Seasons Real Estate, and today we're talking about who pays the buyer's agent. If you're new here, make sure you like and subscribe so you can hear everything Utah and real estate. So when it comes down to it, working with a buyer's agent typically 95% of the time is free to a buyer. So why would a buyer's agent be free to a buyer? Well, what happens when you are working with a real estate agent is a seller hires a realtor to sell their property, and that seller is paying that realtor a certain percentage to sell the property. Now that realtor takes that percentage and decides to share part of that with a buyer's agent to bring an able, ready, and willing buyer. Now, the main question people ask is, why would a listing agent pay a buyer's agent to bring a buyer out of the commission that they're making instead of taking the full amount and making more money for themselves? There's typically multiple reasons, so we'll cover that right now. The first reason, it is actually really hard to have an able, ready, and willing buyer for the same listing that you have, because the processes to find a buyer and a seller are completely different. Because when we are marketing and finding sellers, the conversations we have are different than when we are marketing and finding buyers. It does happen occasionally, and that when it does happen, you can have what's called limited agency, where the listing agent represents both the buyer and the seller. Now, there's a lot of downfalls when it comes to limited agency, mainly because by the time I find the buyer for my listing, I've typically been working with that seller for many, many months. Because the process to get your home ready, I've had sellers do it in a couple weeks, but for the most part, it takes about 6 weeks from the time the seller reaches out to me till the time we're on the market. Meaning I've had 6 weeks to really get to know that seller, get to know their motivation, and really become their friend. So if I'm the seller's friend and I know everything about them, when I meet a buyer who's interested in that property, it's really hard to represent both parties. So I personally actually choose not to represent both parties, and I will choose to only represent one, typically the seller. So if I have a buyer who is unrepresented and wants to see my listing, I'll have another agent in my office come and show the property, because I don't want to be conflicted in who I represent in the transaction. Because one of the major things is you do not want your motivation given away when it comes to negotiation, because that can really hurt you. A great example is if you're moving out of state and you have to be there by the middle of next month, and as a listing agent I told everyone that, all the buyers are going to come through and potentially lowball because they know that you are motivated to get this property sold. It drives me absolutely crazy when I see motivated seller in the comments, because I know that that seller is now not going to net as much money. So sometimes a buyer actually wants to work with the listing agent to get that information to potentially put themselves in a better situation when it comes to buying a property. I personally want the buyer, so the only way a buyer will see a property unrepresented on my listings is if they don't have an agent, they don't want to be represented, then I will make sure they get into the property, because that is my fiduciary duty to my seller. So when you're a buyer and you're working with a buyer's agent, the fantastic part is you don't pay their fee, because as a buyer you have other costs when it comes to buying a property. You typically need to save up for your down payment, and you need to pay your closing costs. So if you had to pay a buyer's agent on top of that, it would be a little more cost prohibitive to buy a home. Where when a seller is paying a buyer's agent, they're paying their agent, and their agent is splitting it. They're typically paying out of their equity of their home that they've lived in for many years that has gone up in value. So the only time as a buyer that you're going to actually have to pay your buyer's agent is if you buy a property where the seller is not paying a buyer's agent commission. That typically is when you buy a for sale by owner. Most of the time for sale by owners list as a for sale by owner for two main reasons. One, to save commission, or two, to hide a known issue with the property. Because when you list a home with a listing agent, you have to disclose on a form everything you know about the property. So if a property has foundation issues, repair issues, roof issues, sometimes a homeowner will sell their home as a for sale by owner, so they don't have to disclose that information because they are not legally obligated to. So depending on the seller and the situation, that is when you might have to actually pay your own buyer's agent. However, what I do is I'll call a for sale by owner and say, hey, are you paying a buyer's agent? And a lot of them will, because at least in their mind they're saving the listing agent commission. And I do air quotes because a lot of the times for sale by owners, price too high, price too low, or don't know how to negotiate when it comes to contract writing or repairs. So even though they're not paying a listing agent a percentage, they oftentimes lose that through negotiation and pricing. But that's another subject for another day. So as a buyer's agent, you have the advantage of working with a buyer's agent who can help you figure out values, figure out what to offer, and get closing costs potentially covered for you. I've had a conversation with a buyer recently that said, well, why would I hire a buyer's agent? Because they're incentivized to make me spend more money because they'll make more money if I buy a more expensive home. But the truth is, if you're working with a buyer's agent who's going to push you towards buying a $330,000 house versus a $300,000 house, that's probably not an agent you want to work with anyways, because when it comes down to it, the actual difference between those two payments are about $900 between you buying a $330,000 house and a $300,000 house. And if making $900 more is going to make or break your agent, that's probably not the agent you want to work with anyways, because agents have fiduciary duties, and if they have what we call commission breath in the industry, where all they're talking about is closing, they really need to make the money, they're not really looking out for your best interest. So how do you know what buyer's agent to hire? I recommend reading reviews and talking to friends and family who have been through the process. And I like reviews because you can read and see what people are saying. Now, if they have a bunch of 5-star reviews with no comments on them, that's probably not a great sign. That's probably they've said, hey, everyone at my party, come give me 5-star reviews, let's have fun. But if they actually have thought out reviews where the buyer or seller potentially spent time writing out a good review for them, they probably know what they're doing. They're probably taking good care of their clients. So if you are looking to buy in the great state of Utah and you would like to hire me to be your realtor to guide you through this process, reach out. I help people buy their first home, their second home, and their dream home all the time.